Hello and welcome to Cherry Red TV. My name is Iain McNay, and today we have in the studio Nick Ralph. Hi Nick.
Hello.
And I've known Nick for a long time now, probably getting on for 40 years. When I first knew him, he was managing a band called Shearwater. In fact, that wasn't quite 40 years ago, but we're getting on for that. And then he was involved with a magazine called Dark Star. And then he had his own record label called Midnight Music, and that's the basis of our programme today, talking about Midnight Music and all the releases, etc., how the label went. And then we'll obviously talk a bit about Nick's history before then and after then. So Nick, as I was saying, we first met when you were managing Shearwater, and then you got involved as a writer with Dark Star magazine.
That's right. Dark Star had been started by some people I was at university with, and I picked up a copy and noticed that I recognised the names of the people involved, so I got in touch. And one of the people also writing for the magazine was a chap called Steve Burgess, who unfortunately now has passed away. But we had an idea eventually of hatching a record label, and to that end we opened a record shop in Crouch End.
Which is in North London.
That's right, yeah. It's North London, yeah. And we thought, we noticed other labels starting up using a record shop as a kind of starting off point. So we thought if we get into the business that way.
What time period was this?
This was, Dark Star was late 70s. We opened the record shop early 80s, I think. I can't remember the exact date. But
okay.
It was around 1980, 81, something like that, because the label released its first record in 1982. So,
because you had Beggar's Banquet coming out of a shop, Rough Trade coming out of a shop. So
that's right.
You're absolutely right.
Funny enough, through opening the shop, I'd met other people in the music business, including Ivo from 4AD, who I'd met before he started 4AD, just as I knew you before you started Cherry Red. So a lot of the people that started labels, I knew them before, and at the time none of us ever had plans to start labels. It was bizarre, really.
So you had the shop, and the shop was going okay at the time, I guess?
Not terribly successfully. We had an established competitor in Crouch End. In fact, at one point we had two competitors, because what used to be the Tourists, who became the Eurythmics, they were associated with a record shop there as well.
Oh, right.
Which had a brief lifespan, but at one point there were three of us, more or less.
Right.
I can't remember if we overlapped or not, but it was quite... too many record shops for Crouch End, basically, but that wasn't really what we intended to achieve. We really wanted to use it as a launching vehicle for a label.
Okay. And so you had the idea for the label, and when you first started thinking about it, did you have in mind a certain image or certain bands you wanted to sign, or was it just a process that gathered momentum?
Just things that we liked, really, and that we thought other people would therefore like. I mean, I wouldn't have signed any band that I didn't like the music myself. Would have never taken on anything purely for commercial reasons. I had to like it myself.
You had to like it, but also hope it would sell enough, because you still have to run a business and pay the bills.
I believed it would sell enough. Unfortunately, I was not right on that in a number of occasions. But that was possibly down to the fact that we didn't have the wherewithal to promote things in a way that a larger label would have done. I mean, our first ever release, Sad Lovers and Giants Epic Garden Music, we filled the shop window with it, and we quite often played it in the shop, and as a consequence it outsold everything, including bands around at the time like U2. We sold more Sad Lovers and Giants in that shop than any other release, because it was in front of people and they liked it. Yeah. So you could draw the conclusion, if you can put it in front of people sufficiently, you will sell the volume.
And that happens with an awful lot of releases. They're great releases, it's good music, and people don't get to hear it, so they don't buy it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So how did you come to sign Sad Lovers and Giants?
Well, through doing the shop, we were getting independent releases in, and we came across a record that we particularly liked that they'd done. It was their second single they'd released on their own label, Last Movement, called Colourless Dream. And we particularly liked that, and we approached the band and said, how do you like to make an album?
Right.
And they went for the idea, and we went up to Spacewood Studios to record it near Ely in Cambridgeshire.
So you actually released an album before you released singles?
Yeah, our first release was Epic Garden Music. So it was a mini album. We called it a mini album. It was cheap price.
And that was quite an intelligent move, because you actually can make money out of selling albums. Selling singles, unless you sell an awful lot of copies, it's a pretty marginal exercise financially.
We released a few singles early on, and then we'd sometimes release a single at the same time as an album, but we released more albums than we did singles in the history of the label, which was probably sensible.
Yeah. So you put out Epic Garden Music, and did it start selling straight away?
It sold reasonably well, and the group had also had a John Peel session, so they were a bit known, and it got into the lower reaches of the indie charts as well, which for our first release was, a reasonable mark to make, as it were.
Yeah, it's quite exciting. I know when we put out our first release on Cherry Red, how exciting it was, kind of getting the finished record and then getting your first radio play and your first review. It kind of, you really feel you're going to go on and conquer the world, and of course
it doesn't quite work out that way, no. But making the sleeve was fun as well. I mean, obviously we probably put a lot more into that than we did into subsequent releases, because it was our own really release and the first attempt. We kind of went overboard on what we did for it, and we got a friend of mine, Cliff Ash, who was a photographer, and we went down to Virginia Water, and we wanted to photograph foliage and stuff like that for the cover, and there's a kind of ruin there that dates from George IV used to have parties there, and we took the photos around this ruin, and the rhododendrons were just coming into bloom, and I can remember we were cutting blooms off some twigs to put them on others to get them in the picture, to get the picture to look right with the right amount of blooms in the picture for the garden. And then we did the photo shoot for the band at Kew Gardens, so we kind of went a bit overboard on that compared to some of the later releases probably, although we put quite a lot into a lot of them in terms of the cover artwork and things like that.
Yeah, so you spent quite a lot of money on trying to do things right, really.
We didn't spend a lot of money on it. We spent a lot of time on it, but we didn't use expensive photographers, and we didn't use locations that cost money, but we spent a lot of time finding the right place to take the picture, and we used pictures that friends had taken of things that, people that knew me would give me photos and say, you might like to use this for a record cover.
Right.
We used a few like that.
So how did the whole financial thing work to start with? Did you borrow some money, or did you just use some money out of the shop cash flow to create the label finance?
I can't remember, to be quite. We didn't borrow money from the bank at that stage, I don't think. I think we were just kind of eking it through. We'd only really started borrowing money when the label got bigger, and then we started buying recording studios as well. And then we had a large debt to the bank after that.
Right.
But what also kicked us off was one of the customers in our shop was Robyn Hitchcock.
Of course, from the Soft Boys.
Yeah, he lived in Highgate, and he used to come down to Crouch End, and he'd come into our shop, and he got friends mainly with Steve, but with both of us. And there'd been an article in Melody Maker where he'd sort of said he was retiring from the music business, and we persuaded him that he'd still been doing some recordings, and we persuaded him that he might like to work with us rather than the big label, and he seemed up for this. So we put out a single of things he'd done at home. It's an EP actually, 3 tracks. It's here.
We have it here. You can show it to the camera there.
Yeah.
So how much did you spend on that artwork?
Robyn gave us the photo because his partner at the time used to take all his photos.
Right. Yeah.
So he had the photography.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
And he even did the typing for the back of the sleeve.
Right,
it was typed by Robyn and signed by him. So it was all very sort of do-it-yourself.
Well, it was very much how things were in those days, wasn't it? Everyone kind of pitched in together, and the artists wanted things a certain way, and they were encouraged to do it themselves where they could.
And he had the rights to some old Soft Boys recordings as well, different versions and tracks that hadn't been released. And we put out a single of those in 2 different covers, in fact. For the collectors, we had 2
That was a smart move. So if you were
if you were a real collector,
fan,
you bought 2 copies of it.
You had to buy both of them, yeah.
Yeah, and that was again taken by the same photographer with a friend of his playing the part of the girl in it.
Right, yeah. So what kind of sales did these records do? What were you selling in those days?
Well, I can't remember how many they sold at the time. I mean, Epic Garden Music, we kept repressing it, but it was only 1,000 at a time. I think we started off with 2,500, but it wasn't long before we had to repress it.
Yeah.
I mean, in the end, I think it probably sold between 10 and 15,000 at the time.
Which isn't bad at all, is it?
At the time we gave up, but in the first year it probably did, I don't know, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah.
I can't remember the figures, to be quite honest. Robyn sold slightly more than that. And we released, then after that we released an LP of obscure Soft Boys stuff. That was a trailer for an LP. But that was the last Soft Boys that was released on our label. We then started releasing stuff for Robyn on his own labels, but we ran it as if they were our labels.
So he had the identity of his own label, but you did all the background work as such.
It was put through our sort of system, as it were. We did the artwork. He usually provided the artwork, but we assembled it and then released it through our channels, as it were. But he made 3 albums specifically for us that were on Midnight Music. There was the acoustic one, I Often Dream of Trains, and then his next electric one, which was his real sort of resurgence back into the real world of rock and roll. That was Fegmania. And then a live LP from the Marquee, Gotta Let This Hen Out. But after that, everything was on his own labels, and of course he eventually went to A&M and other labels after that.
Yeah.
He kind of reinvented himself and then, built his career again and was happy doing it after deciding he wanted to retire at one point.
Right, yeah. Well, I guess that you gave him a chance to rebuild his career to some extent, and he gave you several albums.
It was a mutual benefit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really,
yeah. So did you have sort of people that you looked up to label-wise that you were trying to emulate to some extent? Who were your kind of role models?
By that time, obviously, labels like 4AD were going, and you couldn't, and Cherry Red, of course, and you couldn't ignore the presence of the bigger independent labels and Factory, people like that. I think it was always in mind that I wanted Midnight to be a big independent label, not just one that released 2 or 3 records. I wanted us to become a known label. Because in those days there was a lot of labels that were kind of almost bedroom labels. They put out a few singles, the odd album, but weren't serious businesses. But you were living off your business. I wasn't living off it. Never got paid a penny by Midnight Music. It cost me money. But it was my life. And luckily I had a partner who was prepared to support me at the time, so I didn't need to earn any income, but I never took any money at all from the label. Is that right? In payment, no. Not a penny. So it's a bit. But I had a great time though. it got me into a lot. It got me into concerts. It got me all over the place. It got me on tours. So I got other things out of it rather than a salary. But isn't that what life should be about? Especially with the working part of your life, you're doing what you love. Well, I was lucky. I was able to do that. Yeah. If I'd needed to have an income, I could have never done the label. Yeah. Could have never done it at all. So you were telling me earlier that one of the things where you were quite unusual compared to many labels was you actually had your own studios. Eventually we started off using other studios, and one of the hardest things for us to do was to find the money for recording. And we didn't like to restrict the bands to recording in kind of demo studios and stuff like that. We wanted to make proper recordings, and I got involved in quite a lot of the recordings myself. And we decided in the end that perhaps this was after Steve and I had split up. He decided he wanted to concentrate on the shop, and I then took over the label on my own. So by this stage it was just me. And it seemed sensible to have our own studio, because then the money wouldn't be leaving the system, as it were.
Okay.
We wouldn't be paying someone else's profits or wages and stuff like that. We had our own studio. We bought up Berry Street Studio.
It was in Soho, I think, wasn't it?
No, it was down in Clerkenwell.
Okay.
And we renamed it the Twilight Zone to fit in with the midnight music concept.
There's a question I didn't ask. Where did the name Midnight Music come from?
Nowhere in particular. It was just like having the two M's, and the fact that it lent itself to a good logo, which I thought it was a good logo. Just a very simplified clock face.
Right.
And it lent itself to the catalogue number prefixes as well: chime, ding, and dong.
Okay.
It's just the kind of idea that stuck, I suppose.
Yeah.
It wasn't based on anything in particular.
Yeah.
It just seemed it tripped off the tongue. I thought it did anyway.
I thought you maybe chose it because I know you're a bit of a night owl. And I thought, can you get going at midnight sometimes?
Well, I suppose there was a bit of that to it as well, possibly. It made me think of it, perhaps.
So anyway, you had the studio, and you were pretty much using that full time for your own bands, or were you renting it out?
We did rent it out as well.
Yeah.
Other bands had recorded there before, and the BBC previously used to record bits and pieces there, that they put out. And they weren't called the Communards then. Bronski Beat had recorded there, Susie and the Banshees, before we got involved. We still rented it out if people wanted to, but we pretty much block booked it for ourselves by the time we had it.
You were in a great position then. You had your own studio, you could use it when you wanted and do your own records your own way. Yeah,
unfortunately we still had to pay for it, because it wasn't, although we didn't have to pay for studio time, we had to borrow the money from the bank to buy it.
Had the running costs as well.
So we had overheads in that respect, but we thought it was better that the money didn't leave the system, as it were.
Yeah.
But of course we still had to use other studios as well, so it didn't really quite work.
So how did you run your overall cash flow thing then? Or didn't you?
Didn't really, to be quite honest.
So you just hoped there was enough money in the bank to pay the bills each month?
More or less, yes. We didn't we didn't have a proper business plan or anything like that.
Yeah.
The bank eventually started asking for them, but it was a bit late by then.
Banks generally do, yes. They give you money and they want to see exactly.
But the bank were weird, you see. There was a point when we were looking at buying studios where they were encouraging us to spend far more money than we did. And, obviously when it ended in the early 90s, they decided they didn't want to lend us any money at all and they wanted it back. Yeah. That was the recession. But earlier, previous to that, it's a bit like the situation is now. They were throwing the stuff at you, encouraging you to spend more and more without having a proper business plan even.
Yeah.
There was a place we were looking at in Dollis Hill, the studio there, much more expensive than the one we bought. And they were all up for us, every time I went into the bank they'd say, what's happening about this, And we were looking round at bigger premises in London that would house a studio, warehouse, and all sorts. We did see quite a few. So
one of the bands you signed were the Essence, which actually were a Dutch band, weren't they, I think?
That's right, yeah.
And they were quite successful in terms of you quite a few albums and they sold quite well.
Yeah, they came to us by a friend of mine in Holland called George Knapp, who had been involved in the Holland 1970 Pop Festival, which was the Holland equivalent of the Bath Festival. Huge thing in Kralingen in Rotterdam. And subsequent to that, before I even did Dark Star, I'd been involved before even you met me involved with Shearwater, I'd been a booking agent, and for some reason he came to me to book a folk festival in Enschede in Holland.
Right.
And we had Sandy Denny, Sonny Terry and Brown and McGee, people like that on that. We became friends after that. And the Essence were, the bass player knew his son, I think. It was some connection like that. And I went over there, I'd heard a tape and I went over there to see them. And I liked what they did. And we took them on, and they then became probably our biggest band in Europe. They weren't terribly popular in this country. Everyone thought they sounded too much like The Cure.
It was very similar to the Cure.
Yeah, more so than I realised at the time. Probably, I think he learnt English listening to Cure records.
Okay.
Because he kind of spoke with a Robert Smith his English had a Robert Smith accent to it.
But he was a medical doctor, I think, wasn't he? Or did he become
doctor
afterwards?
Well, not to my knowledge. Maybe he did. But
I'm pretty sure that was the case.
Really?
Yeah, I think so.
What, Hans?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, he's a doctor now.
Really, he wasn't even training as one.
Well, maybe that's misinformation. That's what I understand.
Maybe he completely reinvented himself. Yeah. But he's an intelligent bloke. You know, they for some reason caught on in Europe, especially France and Spain.
Yeah. And
they did tours in Spain, tours in France. They got into the top 10 in Spain. I think it was a radio top 10, not a sales top 10. But they were really popular out there, played some big things.
And this was around, 1985 you had the Essence?
Oh, I can't remember dates that well.
I'm looking at I'm cheating because I'm looking at your schedule here.
If you say it's
85, if this information's right, yeah.
The first Essence LP we released was the 11th album we released, so maybe we probably were a bit slower at getting them out in those days. We had a kind of slow start, then a flood, and then a trickle towards the end.
So you've been going 3 years by that time, because Sad Lovers and Giants, Epic Garden Music was 82. So you were building up nicely with a reasonable catalogue, gathering momentum. How was the whole press and promotion side and the radio side? Did you find you got support from the establishment there?
Well, not as much as we'd liked. Obviously, we used to send all the records to these people and do what we could, and we sometimes used press agents and people specifically to work for us in that respect, but we didn't have a great deal of success getting coverage in the press or the radio, which obviously didn't help us a great deal.
So how did people know about your records? Because people have to understand that this was years before the internet was invented, and there was like 4 weekly music magazines. There was Enemy, Sounds, Disc and Record Mirror. If you didn't get in there, and you didn't get radio play, and the main one, of course, you've already mentioned, was John Peel, 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock during the week in the evenings, Radio 1. If you didn't get that, it was quite difficult to get any type of promotion.
You relied on shops stocking the records and people seeing them, people taking an interest.
The odd fanzine,
things
I guess.
Like that. Yeah, fanzines. I mean, obviously we used to cover all the bases that we feasibly could by sending the records, but that didn't guarantee that they would get reviewed.
Yeah.
As I knew from when I did the magazine, you got given a lot of records you didn't review.
Yeah.
You got given an awful lot of records. We got sent a lot of records ourselves as a label. All sorts of bands would send us, records they'd done themselves or tapes. I remember getting one from the Manic Street Preachers. I didn't realise at the time. It was only later I realised they'd sent me their first single.
You turned them down, did you?
I don't think we ever listened to it. We got sent so much stuff. I don't think we ever listened to it at the time.
Yeah.
Complete with a letter from Richie.
Yeah. Well, they were your Beatles then.
I suppose so. Yeah. But then we may not have been successful if we wanted to sign them up.
So that's true. Yeah.
You can't beat yourself up over that, really.
So you were building the label. You also had Robyn Hitchcock on a separate label, but that was also part of your stable.
He was still on Midnight in 85,
right.
86.
Okay.
It was only later that he really... I mean, the Soft Boys, the re-releases of Soft Boys were coming out on his labels, but his releases were on Midnight until... which one was it? Element of Light was the first one that was on his own label.
Just flicking through some of the names of the albums you had out at the time, you had Snakecore.
That's right.
Who there's still interest in Snakecore because...
Well, they were also quite big on the continent. I mean, the biggest bands on the continent for us were Snakecore, Sad Lovers and Giants and The Essence, probably.
Right.
And they're a similar style of band. They're not the same, but they're not that different from each other. Obviously, the guitarist in Snakecore, Tristan Garofine, was in Sad Lovers and Giants, and the bands toured together, and The Essence and Sad Lovers and Giants even brought out a release that they'd actually worked on together as well. They redid some of their old tracks with the other band's members playing on them.
Did you feel there was like a Midnight Music sound? How did you I know you were saying right at the beginning that you chose things that you like, which I completely identify with and understand, But did you have like an image, do you feel, of midnight music?
Not really. I think it was more eclectic than that, and that was probably because my own taste is more eclectic. I mean, my own taste even went beyond the bounds of the label. I've got quite a wide taste in the kind of things I would listen to musically, right to sort of classical music and even Chinese music. But that wasn't all going to get included in the label, so nothing was kind of off limits apart from sort of standard pop music or soul or something like that, which I wasn't interested in getting involved in. But just any kind of guitar music, really. It was mainly guitar music, but then we deviated from that a bit as well. But there's no sort of similarity between, say, Cindy Talk and Robyn Hitchcock.
No, I understand, yeah.
I mean, Robyn Hitchcock could never understand why we kind of put anything into Cindy Talk at all, and yet they were one of our better sellers.
Yeah.
Especially with Gordon Sharp doing stuff with This Mortal Coil and things like that. You know, he had quite a big following on his own.
Yeah.
And a lot of time went into their releases, a lot of studio time and a lot of time producing the artwork. You know, it was all very intense, really.
And so what was your peak in terms of releases? When were you putting out the most releases? Which year, roughly? Was it around the 85, 86 time?
Probably a little bit later than that,
yeah.
I think.
And you were then doing, what, 2 albums a month? What was your kind of schedule
It wasn't scheduled like that. It wasn't like we have to release a record each month or every other month or anything like that. They came out when they were ready, mainly. Yeah. Towards the end, unfortunately, we couldn't afford to get them out when we wanted to, and they didn't come out when they were ready, and that contributed to our downfall, that we just had records that we just couldn't get out. We had a whole album finished by the Wolfhounds, which was going to be released under their name Candlestick Park, which never saw the light of day.
But
we only released a single from it.
Did you not think at some point, well, we're growing and it's working insofar as, you know, okay, you're not taking money out, but you can pay the bills okay. Did you not think that at some point, well, maybe you need a bit of a business plan or was it you just hope that God would be smiling on you somehow and we'd keep going?
Well, as you know, all it needs is to have one hit record.
So that's what you were hoping for, was the big one?
Not so much hoping for, but obviously in the back of your mind, you know that if you have one successful record, then everything's solved.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but
that was kind of the thinking. But I wasn't pinning my hopes on that. I mean, I'd rather had 10 pretty good sellers than one real hit, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
And obviously we found out from the records we did release and the fact that albums had a longer life than singles, that you could keep selling them, and the bands that sold would continue to sell up to a point, you know. So back catalogue sales of all the kind of better sellers on the label continued. They kept moving through. But obviously if they'd been moving through at 10 times the volume, then that would have made life a lot easier.
Yeah, it's nice to sell a lot more records than you do, of course, and I think it is a myth, because I know so many labels that have had their breakthrough, had a big hit, and then tried to get another hit, and that brought them down in the end, because actually when you're doing really well, that can introduce whole new problems with the whole cash situation.
I can imagine, that you need to put a lot more into it. You have to do it at a different level.
Yeah. So you also signed again, just peeking at the schedule here, you had Sheriff Jack.
He was an interesting character, very, very talented, and I unless he's done something since that has passed me by, I don't know, but we released a few records by him. Yeah. And he was a genius, really. Funnily enough, he married Brian Eno's daughter.
Is that right? Really?
But he was a local chap to Crouch End, another one that we got from basically coming into the shop. Yeah. But he did it all himself, so he didn't ever get out to promote it. I think if he'd gone out and actually had a band and gone out and played live, that it could have been a bit different. I mean, one of the reasons why the artists that did succeed was they were, to the degree that they did, was because they did actually go out and play.
And that's so important, because
The only artist we had that succeeded to any degree without playing was Cindy Talk.
Yeah.
And their stuff was a bit difficult to do live. These days they probably could, because you see all sorts of things being done live now with modern technology. You see Brian Wilson doing Pet Sounds live, and he couldn't have entertained the idea when it was made, or even 10 years later. Just wouldn't have been possible to do it, but he can do it now, and they could probably play live now with the kind of music they were making, but it couldn't be done at the time. They couldn't construct that live.
So meanwhile, I think you'd opened an office in Paris, or was that a bit later?
That was around the mid-80s, probably 86, 87. Through, I can't remember how it really started off, but probably through Sad Lovers and Giants, or the Essence, more likely the Essence, because they were quite popular in France, and they were touring there. And we started releasing not only records that we wouldn't release for the English market, we released as French releases, although we made them available in this country. And then we started licensing, because this chap in France was keen. We set up an office there and started actually licensing other products for France, people like Billy Bragg and Sun and the Moon, which caused us to then, when they couldn't get anyone else to release it in England, we then released it in England as well, and subsequently through that actually signed Mark Burgess, although we never got round to actually releasing anything by him.
I think you did, you had an EP, didn't you?
Yeah, that was the Sun and the Moon. That was licensed, that already existed.
Yeah, okay.
And we then signed him as a solo artist, and by this time we'd got a second studio in Rotterdam, which Hans from the Essence was sort of minding for us.
Yeah.
It wasn't good enough quality to be, a fully blown recording studio, but it produced decent, either very good quality demos or it's stuff probably as good as some people were releasing in terms of recording quality. And he recorded a whole load of tracks over there that never saw the light of day. And he was out there for weeks.
Yeah. So you really were quite international. You had the studio and the office in London. You had the office in Paris. You had the studio also in Rotterdam. So, for a man with no business plan,
no, we also had
you were doing pretty well.
A very good contact in Spain, who in fact is still operating out now. I actually had an email from him the other day, sort of to say hello.
Yeah.
A chap called Miguel Jimenez. And he had a company at the time called Plataforma. He had his own releases, and in fact, partly as a favour to him, but I quite liked the records anyway, we released a couple of his records outside Spain that I actually went over to Spain to re-record the vocals in English. I had to sit there in this studio in Alcacebre, north of Valencia. It was quite nice. We had a place on the beach to stay in while we did it. It was January though,
right.
but it was warm enough for me. And we went through all their tracks, redoing all the vocals in English for the market outside Spain. And that was a bit of a trial, getting them to sing English with any sort of reasonable accent. But we managed it. There was two bands, one called Karmas Collectivos and one called Carmina Burana. But they didn't do... The Carmina Burana had been produced by, I can't remember who it was now, someone who was a known producer in England, had actually made the album in the first place.
So you also signed The Invisible. That was Tom from the Monochrome set, wasn't it?
Leicester Square.
Leicester Square, yeah, that's Tom, that's the same person.
Well, most people would know him as Leicester Square.
Yeah, that's true, Tom Hardy, I call him, but Leicester Square, yeah. So, and that was quite an interesting solo project, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. I mean, they had some fantastic harmonies. That group, they really did. Yeah, they didn't play live, did they? So
not as such, no.
No, I think if they'd played live, they might have got somewhere, but they pretty much sank without trace because there was no profile for them.
Yeah. And then you had albums, well, several albums with Wolfhounds and also McCarthy.
Yeah, that was after. I mean, we took over two labels before we ourselves got taken over. Well, we didn't so much get taken over as swept up. But, Well, September Records approached us, Paul Sutton. They were struggling and they were looking for someone to kind of just take it over, really for the band's sake apart from anything else. And Paul was actually managing the Wolfhounds, so he wanted a label for them, and he basically offered us the whole label,
right,
which was basically McCarthy and the Wolfhounds. And McCarthy seemed reasonably happy to work with us as well. So, and we actually re-released the September releases and then went on to make new recordings with both the bands. But the Wolfhounds weren't happy recording in our studios. They recorded it someplace out in the country that cost a fortune.
So, but were there times, Nick, where you had to say no? That I know that most of your bands now speak very highly of you because they realised that you didn't actually, as you've indicated, didn't make money out of them, but you were doing it because you loved what you were doing, and that's a great reason to do it. And they kind of acknowledge a fair degree of generosity at the time of you spending money on the recordings and the artwork, etc., and them having their own way. But weren't there times you had to say no to the bands with their requests?
There's certainly times I should have done, and obviously I had to say no to a lot of things because they would have liked a lot more than I could provide, all of them, and so the line had to be drawn somewhere. Unfortunately, the line probably got drawn at the promotion rather than the recording level, as it were. Having spent all the money on the recordings, there wasn't much left to promote them.
Right.
But then if you haven't got a decent enough recording in the first place, you haven't got anything to promote anyway. So really, we hadn't got the finance to do it properly. The best thing we could do was make what we thought were good records and hope that that they would catch on and people would buy them.
Yeah.
And obviously bands playing live did help to sell them, and McCarthy and the Wolfhounds also did play live.
Yes.
So, the bands that played live helped themselves as much as they could, and they got better sales as a result of it. The ones that didn't play got worse sales in general.
And of course McCarthy went on to better things as well, didn't they?
Well, they were quite popular in France, and they were another reason for the chap in France getting interested in running the label over there. He sort of appointed himself, really. It got worse than that later.
Right.
Well, unbeknown to me at the time, he was borrowing money from Credit Lyonnais, using his dad as a guarantor. And when it all went pear-shaped, they came to me asking for the money. And I said, hang on a minute, I don't know anything about this. Yeah. We haven't authorised this or anything. And we didn't even know he'd borrowed money. So that all kind of collapsed. I don't know whether they got their money out of his dad or what in the end.
And you were also working with Genesis PRH, Psychic TV.
That was towards the end. That was, I suppose, in a way we saw that as a possible salvation, taking over another label that had, a guaranteed following and profile, and the fact that they played live as well. But they didn't really sell any more than anything else on the label, it transpired. And we'd agreed to pay them quite a lot of money up front, so in the end it was probably not a good move. But he was an interesting chap to work with.
He's a character, isn't he?
Oh, he certainly is, yes.
Yeah. And you did quite a few records, I think, with Psychic TV, didn't you?
I didn't get involved in the making of any of them.
Right.
That was all done by them. We just acted as a kind of conduit, like we were like a distributor, but on a sort of one level before the distributor. We actually organised the manufacturing and all that side of it.
Yeah.
But we didn't actually get involved artistically. Whereas with Robyn, we were involved artistically to an extent. I would sort of go around to Robyn's house and he'd have the bits he wanted to make an LP sleeve out of, and between us we'd kind of make up an album cover, from what he'd done. But it wasn't like that with Psychic TV. It was pretty much, this is the release. Yeah.
So at what point did you first see the writing might be on the wall in terms of the label?
Quite near the end, really, I suppose, because we weren't at the stage where we had to get any more money from the bank. We just couldn't do more than service the existing loan. So we couldn't borrow any more money, and we weren't paying any back. We were just treading water, really.
Yeah.
And towards the end, because we couldn't borrow more money, we couldn't get the most recent, the last releases out in time. By the time we got them out, it was too late. And there were releases by Sad Lovers and Giants, The Essence, Cindy Talk. We had some big records, just records that would have sold well, and we couldn't get them out in the early autumn when we wanted to get them out.
Yeah, looking at your schedule here, there's gaps start appearing after Wolfhounds, Bright and Guilty. There's Chime 0049 seems to be unreleased, and then it was the same for 50, 51.
Oh, no.
That's inaccurate,
they were
is it?
France-only releases.
Oh, I see, okay.
No, every number had a release.
Okay.
The gaps in what you've got there are record. Anything we released in France was part of our catalogue series.
I understand, yeah.
Well, in theory, we subsequently found out that he'd started releasing records under his own numbering system, with a kind of
so
bastard.
So he declared independence of you, at least.
Yeah, he was sort of independent. He was releasing records in France under the name Midnight Music, but with a bastardised version of the logo and a different catalogue numbering sequence.
So they really are collector's items, those, I suppose.
I suppose one of them was an Anne Clark release, which is probably quite collectible. And a couple of really strange things that weren't, in my opinion, ever going to sell, and they didn't.
Yeah.
I don't know. They were very sort of French, I suppose. French have got a funny idea about pop music. I mean, he started off with an interest in McCarthy and The Essence, and went on to do some very odd things. One group was called the Paranoids, I think, who I'd never heard of. Right. Yeah. And I think they sank without trace. We did sign a band from France called Another Country that we recorded in England. But they didn't do very well. They didn't play to support it. So nothing came of that. But we also, our biggest seller in France was probably Bill Pritchard, who had been very big in Belgium, and we'd come to a lot of this through Red Rhino, who then got taken over by Play It Again Sam in Belgium,
right?
And Bill Pritchard was signed to Play It Again Sam, so they distributed us in Belgium, and we released Bill Pritchard in France as a French release. I think we released 3 or 4 albums by him in France. Chime 48, I think, or 49 was the first one.
Right.
Was his. And then we'd had a lot of the holes in that sequence of Billy Bragg. I think it was 3 Billy Bragg albums were released in France. Yeah. And we also, apart from The Sun and the Moon, we had an mini LP by a group called Bradford. Right,
there's a connection with the Smiths there somewhere, isn't there? I think.
Is there? I don't know. Wouldn't surprise me.
I think Morrissey covered one of the songs, I think.
Oh, might have been something like that. Yeah. And we also, I think, our first contact with Medium Cool was putting out a Corn Dollies LP and CD in France of their back catalogue, and through that, when Medium Cool hit trouble, much like September had done, they wanted us to take the label over, which we did. So we acquired the Corn Dollies for the label, and the Pop Guns, and the Waltones, who were changing their name to Candlestick Park. We just released one single by them as Candlestick Park. Right. As I said, there was an unreleased LP. I thought it was a really good LP, and that was one of the ones we couldn't get out at the end. And you've probably got the tapes somewhere.
Well, we're getting ahead of the story here a little bit. So what happened was then the bank were closing in on you. They were kind of saying, we want our money back.
Well, the Medium Cool happened before that.
Okay.
You're going to do it historically. I mean, and not only did we take over the label, but Andy Wake came to work for us doing promotion for a while. Right. And we also had the manager of Sun and the Moon, Rob, and who was also Mark Burgess's manager, also working for us at one point. So at one point we had 2 different people working on promotion. Yeah. But even so, we still couldn't get that much interest going. That was people working in-house, not people we were employing as press agents.
Yeah, no, you pay them a salary.
Stuff like that, yeah.
So, the bank wanted their money back.
Yes, the bastards.
How much did you owe them, do you remember?
I think it was about 160,000.
That's quite a lot of money.
Roughly.
And did you give them a guarantee with your house?
I'd given them a guarantee on the house.
Wow,
yes.
gosh.
And the house wasn't worth that much.
Right.
And they weren't going to get what the house was worth, so I did a deal with them. They wanted to do a deal where they would, I'd owe the money forever. So if I did something successful in the future, they'd have their slice of that pie and whatever interest they wanted to add to it. And I said, no, if you can we'll either agree an amount or you take the house, one or the other, but you're not going to get much for the house because there's not that much equity in it. In a forced sale, you're not going to realise its full value anyway, so they settled for 40 grand.
Right, which is, did a good deal there.
Got a second mortgage for the 40 grand and managed to walk away with it, away from it.
And then you went into administration.
Yes, that was interesting, because the person who came round for the administrators was this enormous girl that played rugby. It's the first time I'd met a rugby-playing female. Emma, she was called. But I don't think they were particularly thorough. They were just, all they wanted to do was scoop up whatever they could quickly. I don't think even all the companies ever got properly wound up. So we had, I think, about 4 companies. Yeah. We had Midnight Music, the record label. We had Midnight Music, that was Records Limited. And we had Midnight Music Limited Publishing Company. Then we had 12 O'Clock Productions, which was for the recording studio. And then I had a company with Robyn called Twilight Manoeuvres. Right.
But you must have felt quite sad, having put like 10 years of your life into this.
I couldn't listen to any music for about 5 years afterwards.
Gosh, yeah, there was a real
just
shock.
Didn't want to listen to any music at all. Yeah. I eventually, in the late 90s, got round to listening to music again, but I just couldn't listen to any music at all, not just our music, but any music. So it did, you know, it was obviously a big life change, as it were.
So just to finish the story in terms of the what happened with the records and the rights, it's actually Cherry Red, my company, which came along.
Well, you bought them off. I didn't do the sensible thing. Well, perhaps I can't remember what I tried at the time. I remember we did get a bit of help towards the end to get the releases out from Steve Mason at Pinnacle.
Right, yeah, the distributor.
He gave us a bit of money, not a lot, but he gave us a bit of money up front. It enabled us to actually press some of the new releases and get the Psychic TV things out. Yeah. So he was the most helpful towards the end. I understand they're not in existence anymore.
Pinnacle went.
But was he there till the end, Steve Mason?
No, he wasn't. No, he sold out about 4 years ago.
Yeah, I thought he might have not lasted the full course.
He was a sharp cookie. He would never go bankrupt. Yeah.
No, he was. I'd a lot of time for Steve Mason. Yeah. You know, some people may have thought he wronged them, but he never wronged me.
So basically, it went down, and Cherry Red bought the rights to the masters.
I probably should have approached you before the receivers turned up. But the bank, you see, they wouldn't have accepted anything that didn't pay off the loan, and you wouldn't have paid the loan, even with the recording studio.
No,
so.
I don't think I would actually.
No, I don't think anyone would have done. Yeah. So it wasn't really saleable. The advantage we had with Medium Cool and September is they worked through their distributors, and they didn't have debts to take over. Yeah. They just had a catalogue and vans, so they were easy to take over. We didn't have to pay anyone any money. Yeah. But anyone to take us over properly would have had to pay money.
There's baggage there, isn't there?
And it's a lot cheaper to take over from the receivers than it is as a going concern, as you know.
So Cherry Red bought the rights and has done quite a comprehensive reissue programme over time. And as you were saying, you affected you quite deeply. You couldn't listen to music for a time, and then you went on. I think you were still doing your design, weren't you? And then
obviously had to do something. I wasn't just going to sit around moping. So I thought, well, one of the things that I'd been doing with the label that I could do that didn't involve music, I'd done a lot of the sleeves myself, even though the designs weren't necessarily mine. Some of them were, but I'd assembled them all on computer. We were actually doing sleeves on computer in the mid-'80s, a long time before most people were doing computerised artwork, just as we were recording to digital at that time as well, recording our albums to digital masters at a very early stage, because we could see with CDs coming that there was an advantage to doing that, although some audiophiles would disagree with that. But it was cheaper. We could do a lot more different versions of things to digital for a much cheaper price than recording to say. It was better quality than 1/4-inch tape, and the only analogue that was comparative was 1/2-inch tape, which is very expensive. So it was a good way of getting a lot of stuff down at a good price.
So looking back on Midnight Music now, Nick, it must be, is it 20 years since Yeah, well, about 18, 19 years since.
Yeah, it was 91, 92-ish, I think, when it folded.
Yeah, sort of 18 years. So what's your feeling about that 10-year period of your life and the records you put out?
Well, it was fun.
Yeah.
It was hard work. I mean, I was sometimes in the recording studio at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, and then I had a label to run the next day.
Yeah.
So it was, although it was run from my house, so the downstairs of we had an upside down house. So I lived upstairs like it was a flat, and downstairs was the label. But I was frequently still asleep when the chap who was working for me at the time came in to do mainly sort of warehousing and stuff like that. And I did for a while someone doing accounts and computing. They were all people from the bands. The chap who did the warehousing type job was the original bass player in Sad Lovers and Giants, and Mark, the singer from the Snake Corps, used to work on accounts.
Right.
For me. But he was trained. He wasn't just any old bod. You know, that was his job before for a travel agent. So he came to work for me doing. So I had people working for me that had an interest in what they were doing. They were in the bands. They were interested in the music. But I'd frequently still be asleep when they turned up for work, and that would be the kick for me to get out of bed. Okay.
You got any advice for someone starting a label?
Well,
thinking of starting a label?
Unless you've got a lot of money, probably don't. I don't know what it's like now. It's different now, isn't it? Because a lot of music now seems to be disseminated through the internet. It's
different, but it's still very hard, I think.
I'm sure I would have thought it's harder, not easier.
I think you're right. It's even though there's more ways of promoting now, I think it's harder.
Probably easier to record good quality recordings cheaply.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that made it difficult with the recording studio. We couldn't sell the studio time we weren't using easily because we weren't a kind of top flight studio, but it was good enough for release quality records at our sort of level, but you wouldn't have got your Michael Jacksons in a place like that.
Yeah.
And at a lower level, especially with synthesizers, people do the stuff at home.
No, things have changed a lot, and it's true.
It's got like that with video now, hasn't it? People can film stuff in broadcast quality.
Nick, we need to finish. Thanks very much for coming in, talking to Purveyed TV about the history of midnight music, and thank you for watching. Goodbye.